Kriti Mehta, and you're watching Deep Dive on News X World. Tonight, we're breaking down a major shift in global diplomacy that could reshape international power dynamics as we know it. Washington has been abuzz with the notion of a new global forum, what's being called the Core-5 or C5, potentially replacing traditional multilateral organizations like the G7. Now, the idea has stirred controversy and raised questions across the globe. What exactly is the Core-5? And why is the US considering such a radical departure from established norms? The Core-5 is a proposed platform that would include the United States, China, Russia, India, and Japan. These countries, all major powers with populations over 100 million, would meet regularly on key issues. The concept suggests sidelining Europe and creating a new, more pragmatic forum focused on global issues that directly affect these powers, starting with security in the Middle East. India's inclusion is particularly interesting. It would find itself in a delicate position, balancing its strategic ties with the US while also engaging with China and Russia. The question is, how will India navigate such tensions? The US seems to be moving away from traditional European alliances. And in fact, the G7, which has long been a key platform for economic and security coordination, is feeling the impact. Tension within the G7 has grown, particularly over trade, China and Russia. While the group still tackles global issues like Ukraine and energy security, the US and others are questioning its effectiveness. This shift is fueling the rise of the Core-5, a potential alternative to the G7. But here's where it gets really interesting. The Core-5 seems to sideline Europe entirely, reflecting a broader trend in US foreign policy. The White House reportedly envisions Europe facing civilizational erasure due to immigration and societal changes, potentially positioning Russia as the dominant power on the continent. This would be a dramatic departure from past US policies, where European unity was seen as a pillar of Western strength. Reports suggest that this idea gained momentum after the US began emphasizing a shift towards deal-making diplomacy, prioritizing direct engagement with major powers over the traditional multilateral frameworks. That's why the Core-5 could be seen as a natural evolution of Trump's America First policy, centered around pragmatic, power-based politics rather than value-based alliances. And let's not forget Trump's style. He's always had a fondness for working with strongmen, focused on what's best for the US and sometimes sidelining traditional European and international allies. This Core-5 would be right up his alley. And then there's the potential for conflict within the Core-5 itself. Chinese President Xi Jinping and US President are locked in a fierce competition for a global influence. Most recently, China and Japan have been involved in a diplomatic tiff of its own in regards to the recognition of Taiwan. Meanwhile, the Russia-Ukraine war rages on. Energy sites are under attack while the civilian death toll keeps mounting. Now, how will these countries, each with distinct regional goals, work together in a forum like C5? What happens when their interests clash? And what will this mean for global diplomacy, and what role will the United States play as it leaves Europe and old allies behind? Joining us on this discussion is now Madhav Nalapit, who's an editorial director with the Sunday Guardian, joins us live from New Delhi. Thank you, Mr. Nalapit, for joining us. We appreciate you taking time out to speak to us in this detailed discussion. I'll start by asking my first question to you, sir. Could the Core-5 replace the G7 as a global power forum, and how will other global powers, especially Europe and the NATO, react to the Core-5?
Well, look, I'd like to point out that the gross national product of the European countries is steadily falling compared to the gross national product of the Asian countries, which are already much bigger. And that disproportion is only going to increase because your countries are hardly growing at all. The problem is that, I mean, now it's not the G7 anymore, it's the G6. Trump has in effect pulled away from it. But the fact is that this G6, they're obsessed with one issue, and that's Ukraine. And they're therefore obsessed with Russia. Whereas Donald Trump has got a very correct point of view, the same point of view as Prime Minister Modi, that Russia should be brought in to an alliance, not the stranger, not be the enemy, the way it's being treated in Europe. So I personally feel it's a very good idea, except that, as you correctly point out, I don't think the Chinese belong to that. I would help make it a quad, four countries minus China, for a simple reason. The Chinese want to compete and overcome the United States in very many metrics, including gross national product. And if they do so, it's going to be a very, very difficult situation for the US and especially its economy, which Donald Trump is focusing on. Therefore, in my view, five is one too many, but four excellent. And if you can get the Russians to move, I think it'll be a great idea. And I think there's no reason why they shouldn't move, because the Chinese have not helped them at all in the Ukraine war, barring, of course, giving them money in exchange for Russian oil. The fact of the matter is that the Chinese have got excellent relations with all the European countries that are fighting Russia, that are enemies of Russia, and the Russians are noticing it. So very honestly, it's a very good idea, except to call it the best idea would be to make it a quad and exclude China from that list.
All right, sure. And for years, the US and the West have positioned themselves as the global champions of civilization and human rights, often even interfering in the affairs of other nations. How does the West sidelining in the Core-5 challenge this narrative and expose the hypocrisy in its self-proclaimed role as the moral compass of the world?
Look, in the first place, I don't think there's any inferior or superior in the international order. I don't think people of any one ethnicity, European ancestral ethnicity, can consider themselves to be a cut above the rest of the world. No question about it. Several countries in the rest of the world are doing far better than the Europeans are doing. And if you look at the United States, you'll find that all ethnicities are doing quite well there. And it's a tribute to the United States that this is happening. It's also happening in Britain. It's also happening in some other countries as well. So I'd like to say that this idea that Europe is the central piece of global gravity is wrong. Today it's Asia that's the centerpiece of global gravity. And from that point of view, Trump is perfectly right in moving from priority to the European continent to the Asian continent. I think this basically reflects that, for a simple reason that Russia is both an Asian and a European power, and the US is independent in its own right. So the fact of the matter is, it's only looking reality squarely in the eye, and I think it's a very good move if it is carried to its conclusion, provided, as I said, with the caveat that China does not belong in this kind of a grouping. And with that caveat, I would say it's an excellent.
Sure, point taken. But let's talk about India's inclusion. It's obviously pivotal given its balancing act between the US, China, and Russia. How can India now manage its strategic ties with both US and Russia? Already has been an impending issue for India, particularly given their competing interests in the region.
Look, the fact of the matter is that President Trump, from early on, even during his campaign, and even during his previous campaign, he was talking of bringing Russia into the camp of allied countries. And I think it's a very good idea. I mean, the fact is that Russia should belong to that kind of an alliance. I mean, if you look at the Chinese, they are people who take advantage of every situation. Now, Russia, for example, the European, many of the countries are fighting them, but in all of these countries, the Chinese are very active and very friendly. So, quite honestly, I don't think there'll be any reason for Russia not to come aboard. And in my personal view, it's an excellent idea, provided China is kept out of it, for a simple reason that China is competing with the US. It is hostile to India, hostile to Japan. So, with that caveat in mind, I would say it's a wonderful idea.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Nalapat, for joining us in this discussion. We appreciate you taking time out. And viewers, that was all for this episode of Deep Dive, but stay tuned for more.